In this session, we will learn about two features in functions, the return feature and the default feature. The return keyword is something, remember when doing something like min of 5 and 2, so we're receiving the result here. This result to be received, there have to be some return keyword, which simply means pass the output of this function back to the caller. So in the previous session we have print function. It takes arguments but it return nothing. Let's now define our main function. So we would like mainly to take two numbers, for example, and if the first is less than the second, then we should return the first one. Otherwise, we should return the second one. So to implement this logic, we say if first is less than second, return to the caller that first is the minimum. Else, return to the caller the second answer. Now, if we are calling our main of A and B, let's say 5 and 20, this function is going to return 5 for you. So the purpose of the return is to send back to the caller the answer of what we were doing. It's important to observe that once the return statement executed, the whole function is terminated. So let's say the function has 100 lines of code, and the third line of code has a return. Once this return is executed, any other thing will not be executed. And this can allow us to get rid of this else statement here. Let's say you are defining our max function to get the maximum. If the first is greater than the second, then we can return the first. Observe here, we don't need to write the else. Why? Because if we are inside this condition, the function will terminate. If we aren't inside this condition, then we are at this line of code. It's very similar to the else. So the else meaning here is more implicit. So we don't need to make it. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the goal of the return statement. We can also return multiple returns, which is very nice and easy in Python compared to language like C++. So let's say we are defining some dummy function here, f, that is returning 3 items. The way that we can take the result is to put 3 commas here equal some f function call. Now if you try to print the ABC, they will be 1 and 2 and 3. So again, if you are returning multiple items, you can take them in multiple variables this way. Now let's learn about a new data type in Python that is called tuple. If you try to put a single variable here in the if function, what will happen is this output would be the 3 items together. If you try to print the type of this item, it would be tuple. Now we can unpack this 3 backed things together to the x and y and z. So observe here, we tried here to take them separately. Here we took them in one item, and now we can unpack it again to our own variables. Notice the following: if you try to unpack something that consists of 3 items in only x and y here, it will give you value error, and the error will be too many values to unpack. And it say expected to. Be careful here. Expected to means that you were expecting 2 values here, but we are saying that too many values, which are 3 values, to unpack here. On the other side, let's say that you try to use 4 variables and make sure to print something of them so the error can come easier for you to be appeared. It says here expected 5. This means that you expected 5 elements, but you got only 3 of them, and it say not enough values to unpack. It means we have only 3 values only, and we cannot give you 5 numbers. You can also, by the way, create a tuple by yourself. You can do that by by writing 2 parentheses and then writing a bunch of things comma separated. This will have the same effect as the function here when it returns something here. We should come back later to the tuples to learn more and more about it, but for now, all what I want you to learn is the function can return multiple items. We can either receive them in separate here in this way, match the number of them, or receive it in one item, which will be a tuple, and we can unpack it in this way. On the other side, a function can return nothing, like our print function. If you notice here, there is no return statement. If you try to take the result from such a function, it will not give you an error. But if you try to print the result, it will tell you none, which means that this function returns nothing. The second feature here is the default feature. See this syntax here, I'm saying what? A, B, which are two parameters, C equal 1, D equal 2. These two things here means they are two parameters with default argument. It means if the user didn't pass the argument to this variable, we can use the default one here. For example, if the user passed 1, 2, 3, 4 to sum them, then 1 go to A, B go to 2, C go to 3, and D go to 4. But what if you just pass 3 and 7? 3 goes to A, 7 goes to B, and the C would take a value of 1 and the D would take a value of 2. So this function can accept a minimum of 2 arguments and accept a maximum of 4 arguments. Now observe that if you try to pass 5 values here, it will give you the type error that we talked about it before. Now try to think about the following. What if I try to make some default variable in the middle earlier? Like let's say, for example, you try to define this function with A equal 1, B with no value, C equal 1, D equal 2. This will give you a syntax error. Why? Because the interpreter cannot know in the runtime which one is going to take which value. So this is refused. The rule is you cannot define a non-default argument. You cannot define a non-default argument like B after a default argument like A. In other words, once you define your first default argument, every argument after it must be default argument. So when I define here C equal 1, the D must be a default argument also. Otherwise, the interpreter will not know how to assign these values. So once you define a default argument, every argument after it should be default argument. In our case here, we defined the A with default argument, but B isn't default argument. So this is going to create a syntax error. That's all.